Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you enjoy true stories from America's hidden past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from our nation's history. Now, let us step back in time to the year 1912, deep in the Missouri Ozarks, where a young woman's life was cut short in a way so chilling, so sorrowful, that her name still lingers in whispers more than a century later. The Ozark Hills of Missouri in 1912 were a place of quiet beauty and hard living. The land rolled like waves turned solid, covered in thick forests of oak and hickory, and dotted with creeks that shimmered silver when the moonlight touched them. Families who lived there often said the land gave much, but it also took much. Life in those hills was demanding. Rocky soil made farming a struggle. Winters came sharp and bitter, and isolation could weigh heavy on even the strongest of hearts. Among the scattered farms and cabins that clung to those hillsides lived a young woman named Eliza Whitlock. She was 21 years old, with dark hair that curled loosely at her shoulders and eyes the shade of storm clouds. Neighbors remembered her as quiet, with a softness about her voice that made you lean in to listen. She was not one to draw attention to herself, but when she smiled, it had a way of cutting through the gloom of those hard Ozark days. Eliza had been born and raised in those hills. Her father, Thomas Whitlock, was a farmer who spent most of his life bent over his land, trying to wrestle corn and beans out of the rocky earth. Her mother, Margaret, was a stern but kind woman who believed deeply in family duty and the strength of faith. The Whitlocks were not wealthy, not by any stretch, but like many Ozark families, they survived by working together, by sharing with neighbors when times grew lean, and by trusting in God when nothing else seemed certain. By the time Eliza was old enough to help in the fields, the family's fortunes had already begun to dim. Thomas's health was failing, a slow wasting sickness that left him coughing deep and hollow through the night. Money dwindled, and Margaret often had to take in sewing from neighbors just to keep food on the table. For Eliza, that meant responsibility came early. She was often seen walking into the small town of Willow Springs with baskets of eggs or butter to trade, her figure slim but steady as she carried the family's hopes on her back. Despite the hardships, there was something about Eliza that gave people hope. Perhaps it was her quiet determination, or the way she would sing hymns while working the fields, her voice floating over the rows of corn. More than once, a neighbor would stop at the edge of their property just to listen. She was known not only for her beauty, but for a gentleness that made her seem older than her years, as though she had carried the burdens of a lifetime long before her time. But as often happens in old stories from the Ozarks, beauty and gentleness could also draw unwanted attention. In 1912, the world was changing, even in those remote hills. The railroads were pushing deeper, strangers were moving into the region, and with them came stories of opportunity and of danger. For Eliza, those dangers would come far closer to home than anyone expected. It began in the summer of that year, a season that came heavy with heat and thick with the drone of cicadas. The Whitlocks were struggling more than ever, and whispers of foreclosure on their farm spread through the valley. Neighbors offered help where they could, but the truth was, most folks had little to give themselves. It was during this uncertain time that Eliza came to know a man named William Avery. William was not from the Ozarks. He was a drifter, some said, though he carried himself with a confidence that made him stand apart from the local men. He was tall, with a lean face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through you. He claimed to have once worked on the railroads, though others whispered he had left trouble behind him in another county. When he first appeared in Willow Springs, many were wary, but he had a way of charming people when he wanted to. And when he set his sights on Eliza, he wasted no time making his intentions known. To some, it seemed natural. A young man showing interest in a young woman, it was the way of things. But others in the community felt uneasy. William's temper was quick, his laugh too sharp, and there was something restless in his movements, like a man who could never sit still too long. Eliza, however, was raised to be polite, and when William offered to walk her home after church, she did not refuse. What began as simple courtesy soon became something heavier. William visited the Whitlock farm often, helping with chores, bringing small gifts, and speaking of a future that he painted in bright colors. He promised Eliza security, a home of her own, freedom from the endless toil of her family's land. For a girl who had known nothing but struggle, the promise of escape had its pull. Yet those who watched closely noticed a shadow beneath the surface. William's charm had cracks. When Eliza hesitated, when she spoke her own mind, his smile tightened, and his eyes grew cold. By the autumn of 1912, tension in the Whitlock home had grown thick. Margaret distrusted William, though she tried not to speak harshly against him for fear of driving her daughter away. Thomas, weak from illness, said little, but there was worry etched in every line of his face. Eliza herself seemed caught between two worlds, the safety of her family's hearth and the uncertain promise of William's future. The turning point came one October evening. A barn dance had been held in the neighboring valley, one of those gatherings that folks in the Ozarks relied on for laughter and music to break the monotony of hard living. Eliza went, her hair tied up with a simple ribbon, her dress plain but neat. William, of course, was there as well. Accounts from that night say he grew jealous when Eliza accepted a dance from another young man. His temper flared, and by the end of the evening, words had been exchanged that left Eliza pale and shaken. What followed over the next weeks would plunge the Whitlock family and the entire community into darkness. For it was in those hills, so often praised for their beauty, that Eliza's story turned tragic. And though more than a century has passed since that fateful year, her name is still remembered in hushed tones. Her story carried like a shadow among the ridges of the Ozarks. The first hints of trouble came when Eliza began to withdraw. She no longer sang while working, her voice falling silent where it had once lifted the spirits of those around her. Neighbors remarked that she seemed tired, her eyes hollow, her steps slow. Some whispered that she had quarreled with William. Others suspected she carried a secret she could not share. Whatever the truth, Eliza's days grew heavy with sorrow, though she kept much of it locked inside. By November, the chill of winter had settled into the Ozarks. Nights grew long, fires burned low, and the hills lay bare beneath a gray sky. It was during one of those cold evenings, as the Whitlocks prepared for supper, that Eliza stepped out into the night and did not return. At first, her mother thought she had gone to fetch water from the well, but when the minutes stretched into an hour, worry turned into dread. Lanterns were lit, neighbors were called, and before long, a search party fanned out into the woods with torches cutting through the dark. What they found would forever haunt the people of Willow Springs. The men of Willow Springs searched through that long, bitter night, their lanterns bobbing like restless stars against the black curtain of the forest. Dogs were brought in to track, their howls echoing across the hollowed ridges, but the ground was hard and frosted, and every sound seemed swallowed by the endless dark. Women waited back at the Whitlock cabin, some rocking babies to keep them calm, others whispering prayers in hushed voices, their eyes fixed on the door for news that did not come. Eliza was gone, and the hills themselves seemed to hold there. Breath at dawn, the searchers returned, weary and pale, with nothing but silence in their faces. Margaret's voice trembled as she demanded answers, but there were none to give. Not a trace of Eliza had been found. No footprints leading from the well, no torn fabric snagged on brush, no cry in the night to point the way. It was as though the hills had opened up and swallowed her whole. In the days that followed, The search widened. Men combed the ridges, the creek beds, the caves hidden in limestone outcroppings. Families left food on the Whitlocks' table, knowing Margaret could not bring herself to cook. Rumors began to circulate, whispered at the general store, traded in worried tones at the post office. Some said Eliza had run off with William Avery, that she had chosen love over her family's wishes. Others shook their heads, swearing she would never abandon her ailing father or leave without a word. And there were those who whispered something darker, that she had met with foul play in the woods that night, and that the man who claimed to love her was the one responsible. William himself was nowhere to be found in those first days. That absence fueled the rumors, turning suspicion into certainty in the minds of many. When he finally did appear, riding into town as though nothing were amiss, the stares that followed him were sharp and cutting. He claimed ignorance, said he had last seen Eliza the night of the barn dance, that she had grown upset with him, but had gone home safely. His words carried little weight. The townsfolk knew his temper, had seen it spark and flare, and they did not believe in coincidence. The sheriff of Howell County, a man named James Harlan, took an interest in the case, though resources were thin. The Ozarks in 1912 were not a place of swift justice or modern investigation. There were no telephones ringing in busy stations, no trained detectives combing evidence under bright lamps. Justice in those hills was slower, more personal, and often more brutal. Harlan questioned William, but the young man denied everything, and with no body, no proof, the law could move no further. It was the way of things without evidence. The truth was left to linger in rumor. But Margaret Whitlock did not believe in rumor. She knew her daughter, knew the weight of her heart, and she refused to accept that Eliza had simply vanished. Each day she rose before dawn, pulling her shawl tight against the cold, and walked the ridges calling her daughter's name until her voice cracked. She checked the creeks, the hollows, the caves where children once played. She searched with the desperation of a mother who could not let go, even when neighbors urged her to rest. Some said she looked half-haunted herself, her face drawn thin, her eyes hollowed from sleepless nights. Winter deepened, and still there was no trace. The Whitlock farm grew silent, the air heavy with grief. Thomas's health worsened, his cough rattling through the cabin walls at night, but he clung to life as if waiting for the truth of his daughter's fate. The family Bible sat open on the table, its pages worn thin from Margaret's trembling fingers turning them over, and over in prayer. That was not until the last days of December that the hills gave up their secret. A young boy named Samuel Turner, barely 12, had been hunting rabbits along a frozen creek when he stumbled upon something half buried in the ice. At first, he thought it the carcass of an animal, the pale curve of bone showing through. But when he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was not an animal at all. It was a hand, stiff and white, reaching upward from the frozen water as if clawing for air. The alarm spread quickly. Men rushed to the creek with axes and shovels, breaking through the crust of ice that had sealed the water tight. Piece by piece, the frozen prison gave way, and there, beneath the shards of broken ice, lay the body of Eliza Whitlock. The sight silenced even the hardest of men. Her dress was torn, her hair tangled with mud and leaves, her skin pale as the snow around her. Though the weeks in the icy water had preserved her somewhat, the marks upon her body told a clear story. Bruises darkened her arms, her wrists bore deep indentations as though bound, and her face carried the unmistakable signs of violence. Margaret collapsed when they brought her daughter's body home, her wails carrying through the valley like a sound not meant for human ears. Thomas, too weak to rise from his bed, wept openly as neighbors laid Eliza upon the wooden table where meals were once shared. A hush fell over Willow Springs, a hush thick with grief and fury, For now there was no denying the truth. Eliza had not run away. She had not abandoned her family. She had been taken, beaten, and thrown into the icy creek to die. And though no one had seen the act committed, every eye turned toward William Avery. The sheriff was called again, and William was brought in for questioning. He denied it still, his voice tight, his eyes cold. He claimed Eliza had left him that night in anger, that someone else must have been responsible. But the community would not be satisfied with denial. In a place where the law was slow and grief was sharp, anger burned hotter than reasoned out men gathered outside the jailhouse, their faces set hard, their fists clenched. Some carried ropes, others carried rifles. They spoke in low voices of justice, of vengeance, of making a man pay for what had been done to Eliza. In the Ozarks, such gatherings often ended in blood, and Sheriff Harlan knew it. He paced the jailhouse floor, torn between his duty to the law and the roar of his own anger at what had been done. For days the tension built, like a storm pressing down on the hills. Margaret, in her grief, begged for justice but feared what might come. Thomas, fading fast, whispered that he only wanted to see truth before he died. The townsfolk demanded action, their voices rising higher each night as the lanterns burned. Outside the jail, the hills of Missouri had seen tragedy before, but this was different. This was closer, raw, a wound cut into the heart of the community. Eliza had been one of their own, a young woman whose song once floated over the fields, whose quiet kindness had touched so many. Now she lay in a pine coffin, her body broken, her story twisted into darkness. And as the year 1912 turned to 1913, the question loomed heavy over the Ozarks. Would justice be found for Eliza Whitlock, or would her death become another shadow? In the hills, another tale whispered by firelight with no ending. The nights grew longer, the men more restless, and William Avery sat behind iron bars, knowing that the walls of the jail might not protect him from the justice waiting outside. The new year came to Willow Springs beneath a heavy sky. Snow pressed down on the pine branches, creeks lay frozen in silence, and the town itself seemed trapped in a strange stillness. Yet beneath that quiet ran an undercurrent of rage. Eliza. Whitlock's coffin rested in the small family plot beside the cabin, her grave marked with nothing more than a wooden cross cut by her grieving father. Her mother visited the mound each morning, her hands raw and red from the cold, her breath rising in pale clouds as she whispered prayers. For Margaret, each day without justice felt like another betrayal, another wound carved into her already broken heart. But justice, as the law measured it, moved slowly. Sheriff Harlan had William Avery locked away, but no trial date had yet been set. There was talk of moving him to a larger jail in West Plains, where he could be held until a circuit judge arrived. Harlan knew the danger of waiting too long. He could see it in the faces of the men who gathered in front of the general store, hear it in the clipped tone of their conversations. Rumors swirled that a lynch mob was forming. The sheriff was no stranger to frontier justice. He had seen men taken from cells in the dead of night, their bodies found swinging from oak trees by morning. He understood the impulse, but he also knew the cost. Such violence, once loosed, left scars not only on the guilty, but on the whole community. Still, he was only one man, and the law was thin in those hills. William himself seemed to know what was coming. Locked in his cell, he grew restless, pacing the floorboards, snapping at the jailer when food was brought. At times he tried to play the innocent, swearing he had done no harm, that others were using him as a scapegoat. But at other times, when no one thought he was listening, his words turned darker. One jailer claimed he heard William muttering that Eliza had brought it on herself, words that spread like wildfire once they reached the townsfolk. To them, Such talk was as good as a confession. Meanwhile, Margaret's grief had sharpened into something harder. She no longer wept openly, but there was a steel in her eyes that frightened even those who came to comfort her. She spoke little, but when asked about William, she said only that God's judgment would not wait forever. A community took those words to heart, and in them many heard permission for vengeance. It was in mid-January, when the tension reached its breaking point. A gathering was called at the town's small church, a meeting meant to discuss the matter of Eliza's death and what should be done. Men filled the pews, their faces grim, their breaths steaming in the cold air. Women stood along the walls, shawls drawn tight around their shoulders. At the front, Reverend Lawson spoke of patience, of trusting the Lord to deliver justice in his own time. His words were calm, but they carried little weight against the roar of grief that filled the room. When the Reverend stepped down, others rose to speak. Some urged restraint, reminding the crowd that without trial they could not claim certainty. But more voices called for action. We know what he did. One man cried, his fist striking the wooden pew. She was one of ours, and he took her. Are we to let him sit warm in a cell while her mother walks the ridges in sorrow? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, growing louder with each passing moment. Sheriff Harlan stood then, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the wall. He spoke firmly, his voice steady, telling them that the law was moving, that William would face trial in due time. But the crowd was restless, their grief too raw to be tempered by promises. When the meeting ended, the men spilled into the cold night, their lanterns glowing like angry eyes against the snow. No words were spoken of what would come next, but every man there understood. That night, Margaret lay awake by the fire, her husband coughing weakly in the bed beside her. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere far off, a dog howled into the darkness. She closed her eyes and saw Eliza's face, pale and still, beneath the frozen water. She thought of William in his cell, and though she prayed for justice, she also knew that sometimes justice came not through courts or judges, but through the hands of the people themselves. 2 nights later, the mob formed. It was after midnight when the sound of boots echoed on the frozen ground outside the jailhouse. A dozen men, their faces shadowed by hats and scarves, stood in the moonlight. Some carried rifles slung across their backs. Others held lengths of rope coiled at their sides. They did not shout, did not chant. They moved with grim purpose, like men who had already settled their hearts on what must be done. The jailer, an older man with shaky hands, tried to stand in their way, but he was pushed aside. The cell door was unlocked, the iron bars swung wide, and William Avery was dragged from his cot. He cursed and struggled, his voice sharp in the cold night, but his captors did not falter. They bound his hands, forced him out into the street, and led him through the silent town toward the grove of oaks at the edge of the hollow. Some said Margaret stood at her cabin window that night, watching the glow of lanterns move across the snow. Others claimed she sat by her husband's side, unaware of what was unfolding. No one truly knew. But by dawn, the deed was done. William Avery's body was found hanging from the great oak tree that stood where the ridge met the creek, his head bowed forward, his eyes frozen open, his boots swaying gently in the morning wind. A scrap of paper had been pinned to his coat, scrawled with 3 words, "For Eliza's justice." The sheriff arrived too late to stop it. He cut the body down himself, his jaw clenched, his hands steady, though his heart trembled. He knew that whatever law he represented had been overrun by the will of the people, and in truth, he could not bring himself to condemn them. When word spread, the town was divided. Some felt relief, believing the hills had been cleansed of a dark stain. Others feared what it meant for the community, that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The Reverend preached against it from the pulpit, his voice breaking as he warned that vengeance belonged to God alone. Yet even he could not deny that justice, in some form, had been delivered. Margaret did not attend the burial. She stayed at home, kneeling by her daughter's grave, her lips moving in silent prayer. When neighbors asked her later what she thought of William's death, she spoke only these words, "No rope can bring back my child." But for all the finality of William Avery's fate, the story did not end there. The Ozark Hills are not quick to forget, and whispers lingered in the hollows long after the snow melted and spring brought green back to the ridges. Some whispered that William had not acted alone, that others had known of Eliza's suffering and had turned their eyes away. Others claimed that William's ghost haunted the oak where he was hung, his shadow swaying in the branches when the moon was high. As for the Whitlocks, their sorrow did not fade. Thomas died before the spring was out, his frail body giving way. At last, as though he could not bear to face another season without his daughter, Margaret carried on, though those who saw her said she moved like a woman living half in this world and half in the next. She tended the farm as best she could, but the fields grew sparse, the fences sagged, and the songs that once carried over the hills were never heard again. The town of Willow Springs carried the weight of Eliza's tragedy. Like a scar, it was. Spoken of in hushed tones, told to children as a warning, whispered in the quiet of evenings when the wind pressed against the shutters. And though justice had been carried out by rope and oak, a question still lingered, whether the community had truly honored Eliza's memory or whether they had only fed their own hunger for vengeance. Years would pass, but the name of Eliza Whitlock remained. It clung to the hills, to the frozen creek where her body was found, to the oak tree where her killer met his end. Some said her spirit wandered still, searching for peace in the ridges she had once called home. Others believed her story was less about ghosts and more about the unyielding sorrow of a family torn apart, a sorrow that could never fully be healed. And in that sorrow, the people of the Ozarks found a reflection of themselves, of the hardships they bore, the tragedies they endured, and the fierce justice they sometimes demanded when the law could not answer their cries. Spring came to the Ozarks in 1913 with its usual mix of beauty and burden. The redbuds bloomed along the ridges, wildflowers carpeted the hollows, and the creeks, once frozen, now ran swift and clear with snow. But for the people of Willow Springs, no season could wash away the memory of what had come before. The winter of Eliza Whitlock's death lingered in their minds like a shadow, and the great oak tree where William Avery had swung stood as a grim reminder of how grief had turned into vengeance. Neighbors avoided that oak. Children dared each other to step beneath its branches, but even the bravest ran home with fear in their eyes. Hunters crossing the hollow swore they felt watched when they passed it, and some claimed they saw a figure swaying in the moonlight when the wind was still. Whether it was William's restless spirit or the memory of their own hands at work that night, no one could say. But the oak stood, silent and immovable, as though keeping watch over the secret it had been made to hold. The Whitlock farm struggled. With Thomas gone, Margaret was left to manage the land alone, her back bent from labor, her hands stiff with age and grief. Neighbors helped where they could, but Margaret rarely asked. She moved like a woman hollowed out by sorrow, her eyes often fixed on the ridge where her daughter had last walked into the night. She tended Eliza's grave with the devotion of a mother who could not let go, laying wildflowers there in spring and evergreen boughs in winter. Some said she spoke to her daughter each morning as if she were still alive, her voice soft and steady in the dawn light. Years passed, and the story of Eliza Whitlock began to take root as legend. In those hills, stories were passed from porch to porch, from fire to fire, until they became part of the land itself. Some told it as a tale of caution, that a woman must be wary of men who come with charm but no roots, for smooth words can hide cruel hands. Others told it as a testament to the strength of community, how a town had risen in anger to avenge one of their own when the law moved too slowly. And still others told it as a tragedy without comfort, a reminder that no matter the justice claimed, a mother's loss could never be undone. By the 1920s, when the railroads had cut deeper into the Ozarks and new families had moved into the valleys, Eliza's story had already taken on the shape of folklore. Children were warned not to linger too long by the creeks after dark, lest they hear the sound of a young woman's cry carried on the wind. Hunters claimed to see a pale figure drifting between the trees, her hair loose, her dress torn, vanishing when approached. Some said it was Eliza searching for peace. Others swore it was her spirit protecting young women from suffering her fate. But for the older generation, those who had known Eliza, who had heard her voice in the fields, who had seen her mother's grief firsthand, the story was not ghostly entertainment. It was memory, raw and painful. They spoke of Eliza's kindness, of her quiet smile, of the hope she had carried even in hard times. They remembered her as more than a victim. She was a daughter, a neighbor, a young woman whose life had been cut short before it could unfold. Margaret lived on for many years, but she never remarried, never left the farm. The seasons came and went, but she remained, her body growing frail, even as her will remained iron. Folks who visited said she was never bitter, only sad, as though part of her had already gone with Eliza. She died quietly one winter morning, her Bible open beside her, her hands folded as if in prayer. Neighbors laid her to rest beside her daughter and husband, the three Whitlocks together again in the quiet of the family plot. Time carried on, as it always does. The Whitlock farm eventually fell into disrepair, its fences broken, its fields overgrown. By mid-century, only the foundation of the cabin remained, half hidden by vines and brush. Yet the graveyard endured. Travelers who stumbled upon it sometimes found the wooden crosses, weathered and tilting, still bearing faint carvings of names nearly lost to time. The grave of Eliza Whitlock, though worn, remained a place of quiet reverence for those who knew the tale. Even today, the story is remembered in the Ozarks. It is told in hushed voices at gatherings, retold in local histories, and whispered by grandparents to children when the nights grow long. Some speak of the horror, the girl who vanished into the night, the body pulled from the frozen creek, the mob's fury at the oak tree. Others speak of the sorrow, the mother's endless vigil, the father's broken heart, the silence that hung over the farm. And some speak of the mystery, wondering if the whole truth was ever known, or if the hills still hold secrets that were never spoken. For in stories like Eliza's, truth and legend entwine until they are almost inseparable. Perhaps William Avery was guilty beyond doubt. Perhaps others bore blame that was never uncovered. Perhaps justice was done that night at the oak tree, or perhaps it was only vengeance dressed in justice's clothes. What remains certain is the grief, the human cost that cannot be erased by rope, by trial, or by time. And that grief is what makes the story endure. It is not only the horror of Eliza's death that lingers, but the tenderness of what was lost. Songs she once sang in the fields, the hope she carried in her heart, the love of a family that could not save her. The Ozarks remember not only the tragedy, but the life that came before it, a reminder that behind every legend is a human soul who laughed, who loved, who lived. So the story of Eliza Whitlock became more than a local tale. It became part of the tapestry of old America, a reflection of the struggles and sorrows that marked the lives of so many in the early 20th century. It stands as a testament to the harshness of life in the hills, the dangers faced by women, the thin line between justice and vengeance, and the enduring strength of memory. Even now, more than a century later, some who walk the ridges of the Missouri Ozarks swear they feel her presence when the wind turns cold and the creek runs dark. They say if you stand by the water where she was found, you may hear the faint sound of a hymn rising through the trees, carried on a voice soft and steady, like the one she once sang while working the fields. Others claim that if you pass beneath the oak on a winter's night, you may hear the creak of rope in the branches, a grim reminder of how her tragedy pulled the whole town into its shadow. But whether ghost or memory, legend or truth, Eliza's story is not forgotten. It remains etched into the heart of the Ozarks, a chilling tale of sorrow, love, and loss that has outlived all who first bore witness to it. And perhaps that is the truest measure of her legacy, not the violence that ended her life, nor the rope that answered it, but the enduring memory of a young woman whose song still echoes in the hills she once called home.